Hey everybody, I'm finally back with a new video, and today I want to teach you how to make liquid drum and bass. And I know I'm going to pull in quite a bit of an audience from the UK, and just letting you know that us over here, us Yanks in the US, can actually make some proper drum and bass. I know it's hard to admit that it's not possible that something like this could ever happen in the world, and it's only a genre in the UK, but us Yanks are going to show you a little bit of how it's done.
I can't hold back when it comes to you. Come fill me up with your love. Ooh, you know that I'm obsessed when it comes to you. I'm overflowing with your love. Ooh, I cannot help myself with you. Oh baby, I cannot help myself with you. Oh baby, take me deeper, deep down inside. I want you deeper, deep down, alright.
I don't know about you, but I think that sounds pretty good, especially for a cheeky git like myself. Alright, so what I'm going to do is break this song down piece by piece, and I'm also going to try to simplify some parts and really just get down to the most fundamental and important things to think about when it comes to writing drum and bass. And then also there's going to be videos that I've wrote for other genres that I'm going to recommend because they'll fit really, really well into what I'm explaining here. And if any of you know any labels that would be interested in signing a wonderful American like me, who cannot want to sign somebody that represents the freedom of the great free world on their label? Okay, so let's do a quick preview of our drums and what we have going on. I want to start there because that's one of the most important parts when it comes to making drum and bass. Obviously, it's going to be the drums. They sort of form the entire sort of character and foundation of your song. You know, the type of drums that you choose is going to really, in many ways, almost like dictate the style that you're going to write. So as you can see with my drum pattern, I have some very traditional sort of stuff going on, but with just a little bit of drum fills and stuff like that to make it more interesting. So with our kick and snare pattern, I'm not adding a ghost sort of snare hit, you know, every single time. I'm sort of doing it in some strategic places just to add some variation and to fill in some parts of the groove of the song that I felt needed a little bit of accenting. And as you can see what I have going on down here, we're just doing some variation of our velocities so it's not so robotic and like perfectly straight. And as you can tell, there's definitely a lot of sort of, I guess you could say, quantizing of the overall level of things, which is again kind of important because what we're trying to do is send a consistent signal to our drum bus and stuff like that. So taking a look down here at the kick sample, because I have that almost like doubled bass sort of kick sound going on. And the reason that I'm doing this sort of velocity change like this is because it doesn't sound too jarring. So, you know, when you have that standard kick snare sort of pattern, that second kick within the pattern is sort of hitting exactly where you expect it, but it just has an additional one, a 16th note after. And I'm just sort of de-emphasizing that second 16th note a lot so that it feels much more natural and cohesive rather than like it almost sounding like metal drums, which is kind of not what I'm going for in this sort of style. And then here I just have another drum fill. So what we're really trying to think about is using these fills in a more compositional way and sort of thinking about, okay, what fills are going to signify a more, you know, a significant transition in the song from like a verse to a chorus versus something that may just be a fill at the end of the bar while we're still in the verse or while we're still in the chorus. So that's just something to really think about when you're sort of writing your drums. And with our hi-hats, I think in drum and bass and also in most genres, it's really important to have some variation and sort of accenting and stuff like that with our hi-hats. So with this, I did something pretty simple, but it was effective enough to really get the idea across of what I wanted in the song. So I just am using different sort of hits of the hi-hat to create different variation in our sound. So as you might know and understand that a drummer can hit a hi-hat with it opened or partially open, they can hit the hi-hat and then close it down, and then they can also use the foot pedal to sort of use the hi-hat without any sort of sticks or anything like that needed to produce a sound. And many things, especially coming from a background in funk music and stuff like that too, you can use all kinds of different combinations. So you can emphasize the 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Or you can do the other and then emphasize the upbeat. But generally in drum and bass, we kind of tend to emphasize the 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's the synthesized kick that I'm using that I thought sounded nice. And then the other thing, I just have an acoustic kick on top with just some of the high end poking through. So with this sample, you can see it definitely has some of that top end, but additionally it has some of that room information about sort of where it was recorded. So you have the microphone and then the overall room environment that sort of leaks into the sample, and I think that just adds a little bit more character and also just creates a more organic sort of sound. Well, as you can see, I took those two and then combined them together, and I just sort of created my own sort of drum sound. Nothing too crazy. Drum and bass producers have been doing this since the 90s. And then with that, I just did some EQ to try to make sure each thing has its own space that it occupies. So the low end of the kick has its own sort of space there, and the top end has its own there. And if we take a look at the snare, it's a couple different samples too. So I have that main snare, and then underneath that I have a little clap sample that's super, super quiet, to the point that probably it's not even needed. So one other thing that's really important to think about when you're writing drums for drum and bass, some of you who don't listen to this genre might immediately notice that the sort of tuning of the drums tends to be quite high. You know, you could say this sort of naturally comes from the artifacts of, you know, pitching up drum breaks to match a tempo that's much faster than they were recorded at, which is definitely true. But I think also when it comes to our perception and sort of how we hear music, especially at higher speeds, I think even after we sort of moved away from strictly, you know, sample-based break music, you know, with the early jungle era and into the drum and bass era, to me it just makes sense that we would still end up pitching our drums up because it sort of matches that overall speed and feel of drum and bass more. And what I mean by that is, you know, when you have a higher pitch sample or sort of a higher tuning, it changes the overall transient nature of the drum itself, and then also lends itself to a quicker decay on the sound. You know, because especially in music this fast, if you have long decay on all these instruments, it sort of just messes with the sort of cohesiveness of having, you know, a song that's written at like 174 beats per minute. So one thing, if you're going to get a takeaway from what I'm explaining here with the core foundation of our drums, is just to sort of think about maybe having higher pitched drums in general. It's not that you can't go lower, but you're going to have a lot more trouble with everything being cohesive. Plus, when you hear it in a club environment, it can actually kind of sound really not that great with having these long decaying kicks. You know, it just can throw bass around the room in a way that's not pleasant, even in the nicest of rooms. So it's important to really think about that kind of stuff. So the next thing I'm doing is also some very modern and standard production techniques. So I'm taking this kick and snare and then I'm throwing it through a clipper and then a limiter. So it's really important also when we send things into our clipper and our limiter that we actually have a faster decay on our drums, because when we clip the tops of our signal off and sort of bring our gain back up, we're going to actually get more sustain from our sounds. And if you already have a sound with a lot of sustain and then you do limiting and clipping on top of that, now you're going to have a really big problem with a lot of tails and decay on your sounds. So it's why I think it's really important to make sure, especially in drum and bass, that we have a very fast decay time and that we're not having things sort of, you know, with a lot of sustain. Okay, so moving on, I decided to take a live sort of drum sound and layer that over top of the more synthesized and sort of precise sound so that I can try to get the best of both worlds. You can do this through having a drum break if you want to, that's totally fine. But in this case, I wanted to use Addictive drums and sort of get a little bit more in depth into what I wanted to write. And then also just having all these individual mixer out channels and stuff like that allows me considerably more control into sculpting the sound to perfectly match sort of what I'm thinking about in terms of my overall goal of having, you know, once again, a loud mix that is really well contained and precise. So let's preview just the live kit on its own. Hey guys, I need to make a brief interjection. If you like this video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe so you keep up to date on all my most recent additions. And if you really want to support me, feel free to donate on Patreon because it helps out quite a bit in terms of what I'm doing and just will allow me to make more diverse and nuanced content by allowing me to invest in sort of what I'm doing here on YouTube. So if you are wanting just to support me and stuff like that, feel free to donate on Patreon. It's always greatly appreciated and it does definitely help. But anyways, thank you so much for watching and let's get back into the video. So there's a lot of mixing stuff going on here that's going to be a little bit too much for this video, but let's explain the core concept. Once again, for the kick and the snare, Both of them are high passed, and I'm using some compression just to make sure I'm controlling what's happening. With a live kit and a live environment, you tend to really need compression to sort of tame things and get them in place so that you're not having too much unpredictable behavior happening within your drum kit. So I'm sort of hybridizing some modern techniques with some traditional old school. So another thing when it comes to our drums is going to be our hi-hat and sort of what's going on there. So just showing you, I have some compression on top of the hi-hat to make sure it stays under control. So nothing too special. I'm just trying to make sure that when I have open cymbal hits that are naturally going to be louder, that they're not just jumping out in the mix in a way that is going to be distracting. So with our room mic and our overhead mic, it's going to be very simple. I just have a very light compression going on, just trying to control some of that top end. Introducing a bit of distortion to the virtual channel, adding a little bit of roll off on the top end through the EQ, and then once again just compressing that high end so we don't have a lot of weird peaking going on. And then I brought this into a fab filter. And then on top of that, I have the kick and snare that are side chaining the room head mic and the overhead mics so that they're ducking out of the way when those sounds hit. And the reason that I'm doing this is I want to make sure that the initial kick and snare that I started with as a foundation are the ones that are the most prominent and that stand out in the mix. So additionally, I even have one more layer for the snare, and it's this right here. So just a very standard sort of liquid drum and bass snare. And then once we combine it together, we get this sort of feel. So then after we finally made it past these two layers, I have a hi-hat layer going on. So with this, I just used an instance of XO and then loaded a bunch of hi-hats that I sounded interesting and just sort of added variations throughout the pattern. So if you're not doing a live sort of feel, this is a very standard practice of taking different cymbals and sort of hi-hat sounds, you know, adjusting and changing the decay on the various sounds and sort of panning them throughout the stereo field. It just sounds a little bit more interesting. And so then I just have what's very important. It's like standard. It's a must-have for drum and bass, and that's a tambourine on top. And I'm just putting it there high pass in a way that's very subtle and just adds a little bit more 16th note movement, but also just adds additional textural elements to the overall sound. So then what I did is just use an electronic sort of synthesized sound on top, which is just a cymbal hitting on quarter notes. And then I used the worm break, which is a really standard one. I remember back in the day when I used to, I was like a huge fan of Will Miles, and I can't remember what song it is, but he used like the worm break, and it's sort of like showed me like how awesome it was, and I just love that cowbell sound. So then you combine it with the cymbal. As you can tell, there's kind of like a hierarchy. The kick and snare are going to be the loudest, then followed by the hi-hat, which is going to sit a little bit quieter, and then everything else is going to be much quieter just to sort of fill out that additional space that would be lacking. With something like that cowbell sound, you may notice that it's like very quiet, but when it's missing from the drum break, I feel like it's missing a lot. So for the drum bus, I'm going to make a very quick run through it, but you can see there's several different layers of things going on. So for the first thing, I'm running it through some transformer style saturation, and I'm doing that because I really like the way that the kick sort of breaks up the top end. It just sounds very natural and pleasing to me. So here's everything without it. So now we're going to take True Iron and load that on top of it. So if you're really paying attention, you might notice that it's sort of taming the transients a little bit, adding subtle sustain, but also adding some very natural variation and non-linearities to the sound. Then the next thing I'm doing is running it into some tape saturation and emulation, just to add a little bit more variation and sort of subtle changes. You know, it's very subtle, but it's just introducing some harmonics here and there to add more uniqueness. Then next I'm going to Slate Virtual Mix Rack and I'm adding a little bit more saturation and then some subtle compression. Because I did most of my EQing beforehand, I don't really need to touch much with the EQ at all, other than maybe boosting a little bit or cutting here and there. But I'm running it into a virtual channel to add some saturation, some simple EQ, and then I have a compressor on top of it, which is a VCA style compression. And the reason I'm using this kind of compression is it's sort of an old school way of sort of using a drum bus, where I add some compression that really just evens out the sound and sort of glues everything together. So what the compressor is really doing is it's just sort of overall riding and sort of guiding the peaks and crests of the sound to create a more uniform feel, with imparting a little bit of the characteristics of the style of compression layered on top of it, but also just providing a little bit of consistency. I just think it sounds a little bit more natural to our ears when we're doing something like this. Then finally, I have it going into an instance of Loud Max, and I'm actually hitting it with the limiter. And the reason I'm doing that is I really don't need a clipper at this stage because all the signal going into this limiter is really consistent. So I'm not really needing to control a lot of untamed variables within our sound. And really, once we add that limiter, it really sort of glues everything together, and now it sounds like a really cohesive sound. And you may notice that when I talked about earlier how when we reduce sustain from the individual samples we're using and we start to add more compression and sort of limiting, that we get some of that sustain back in the end, and you really can start to hear it when we add that limiter. So a brief takeaway for our drums, we just want to make sure that we're setting a simple groove, and in this case I'm choosing that standard two-step groove with a little bit of variations with our hi-hats and our snare, just to create some transitional stages of our song moving from one part to the next, and also to add some variation and interest. And I really think when it comes to liquid drum and bass, especially when it comes to a lot of the stuff now that I think can sometimes be a little bit monotonous, this really just adds a bit of our own personality and our spark. Alright, that's enough for now. I think this is going to conclude my video for today. Hopefully you found this information useful. I know that it was a lot to sort of digest and go over. If you have any questions or comments or anything like that, leave them below. And thank you so much for watching.